Okay, good evening. It's I think, the established protocol that we make a little brief self-introduction. Some of you already know me. I see some of my students down the back. Seeing as I'm going to be talking about sports today and about football, I think it's appropriate. I'm playing at home today because I'm based here at the University of Leon, but I'm also to some extent playing away from home because my primary interest really is Irish literature, but also Irish literature in context, or in contact, I should say, with other spaces beyond the space of Irish literature. And from quite an early stage, I've been involved in the Afroeuropeans project, and I'd like to thank Markey for the support from the very beginning. It's not my primary area of interest, but it is something that motivated me when I got involved with the Afro-European project from the very start to actually decide to, when I looked to what I wanted to do with my doctoral study, when I wanted to do my PhD, I eventually decided I was looking for a way to interpret Irish literature in relation to post-colonial critique. And as a result of my initial involvement in this, I eventually ended up doing my PhD on, which was a comparative study between an Irish public intellectual, Sean Fuelon, in relation to Donato Ndongo from Equatorial Guinea. So I do have some stripes in the area. It's not absolutely my specialist area, but first of all, I'd like to say it's an absolute pleasure to be able to participate here today. Now, what I propose to do this evening is something I think rather unusual. I'm going to talk about a book in an academic context, to talk about a book on football. I anticipated a positive reaction. What?
You've already done it before.
Yes, we'll come to that in a moment. I did expect a reaction. I expected a reaction that would be more like a glaze falling over the eyes of all my listeners. So thank you very much for the at least a little bit of a positive reaction. Because generally speaking, to be honest, when one engages with something like football, that it provokes a lot of hostility. I think it provokes a lot of hostility because of the fact that it is a multi-million, billion industry, which involves, as we'll come to see, a lot of exploitation, particularly a lot of exploitation of young people, particularly coming from the African continent. I'm going to talk specifically, as is evident in my the first screen here, on Godwin, which is a novel by the Irish writer Joseph O'Neill. But before I go into that, I think it's worth considering why football has featured so little in literature, given the fact that it's such a huge global phenomenon. And perhaps it's because of a sort of a high culture disdain for the sort of practices of the ordinary folk, of the lower orders. If you take, for example, Jorge Luis Borges, he said that football is popular because stupidity is popular. But then he was Argentinian, and he was also, let's be honest, an insufferable snob.
Absolutely.
Let's leave it there. The great Albert Camus, by contrast, wrote, "Everything I know most surely about morality and duty I owe to football." Top man, Albert Camus. In Critique of Dialectical Reason, Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, "In a football match, everything is complicated by the presence of the opposite team." He was clearly a top philosopher with something as substantial as that. And then he went on to say, "The positive reciprocity between members of a team is closely connected with a negative and antagonistic reciprocity. But this complication does not alter our problem in any way. Perhaps or perhaps not. Perhaps from football, soccer, or I must stress association football, we may find the potential to start fixing the problem of polarization and racial exclusion, as Elisa Joyce White noted on Tuesday in relation to the Spanish extremos, Lamine Yamal and Nico Williams. And they are hugely influential figures in relation to moving away from racial exclusion and polarization. Now, I would like to talk far more about the value of the beautiful game, my justification for the beautiful game. Don't have time here because we're going to talk specifically about Joseph O'Neill's Godwin, but I do have a little chapter in this book, edited here by Sharmila, in relation to the value of football, particularly from an Irish context, because you have to understand that in an Irish context, the so-called native games of Gaelic football and hurling, which are considered to have an authenticity, dominated the discourse. So consequently, football, association football, soccer had a different quality. In other words, it was sort of anti-hegemonic, if you like. It looked out to across the border to the international sphere, if you like. But let's turn to Joseph O'Neill and Godwin. Now, this man, O'Neill, he's a fascinating character. He was born in Cork, Ireland in 1916 to an Irish father, but his parents moved around from a very early age, and he lived first in Mozambique, in Turkey, where his mother was from, Iran, before then subsequently mainly growing up in the Netherlands. Subsequently, he studied law at Cambridge and qualified as a barrister. Worked in London for a decade before moving to New York in 1998 to write full-time, where he actually lived in the famous Chelsea Hotel, like Leonard Cohen, with his Vogue editor wife and children. So he's quite a glamorous dude. Godwin is O'Neill's fifth novel, and he's also published a family memoir and a collection of short stories. But it was his third novel, Netherland, which I have here, which was The Game Changer. It was please excuse me if I have some of these footballistic expressions throughout the paper. It was a game changer. It was a huge commercial and critical success, described by author and critic James Wood as one of the most remarkable post-colonial books I have ever read. Its popularity was particularly helped by a recommendation from none other than Barack Obama. And it's about a Dutch financial analyst in post-9/11 New York who's estranged from his wife, but finds direction and meaning in the relationships he develops while playing cricket, or playing at a cricket club frequented primarily by immigrants of Caribbean, Indian and Pakistani descent. We have the novel here. And here we have the man in his cricket gear. As Irish Times journalist Keith Duggan suggested, it caught the post-9/11 disquiet of New York. It's a portrait of the city as viewed through the keyhole of its immigrant cricket scene, which I think is evident in this particular edition of the work. So it's a keyhole. It's a very particular perspective that it opens up into a whole broad world. Absolutely fascinating book. I would wholly recommend it. A thematic continuity of looking at life from the margin and from below is evident in his following novel, which is called The Dog, from 2014. It was narrated by a New Yorker who left the USA for Dubai to work as a lawyer for an immensely wealthy Lebanese family, and it exposes the exploitation and humiliating servitude of workers of the globally mobile super rich, but primarily does so by means of humour. Explaining his interest in writing about Dubai and The Dog, O'Neill has stated that I've moved around so much and lived in so many different places that I don't really belong to a particular place. And so I have little option but to seek out dramatic situations that I might have a chance of understanding. If here, O'Neill downplays the ethical grounding of his work, this is nonetheless evident in the fact that his 2018 short story collection, Good Trouble, was named for a speech made by the US Afro-American civil rights leader John Lewis with the title Speak Up, Speak Out, and Get in Good Trouble. Good influences. But let's turn to Godwin. It's similarly marked by a humour, above all, by a playful, humorous tone, and it has a very engaging narrative drive with the heart of, I think, above all, the adventure story. But also, it engages in a profound reflection on the ills of the modern world, the global reach of these ills, and their deep historical roots. But on this occasion, this is achieved by focusing on Africa and specifically on the problematic nature of the business of football today. Now, initial critical reaction to the novel has actually been quite mixed, and largely as a result of the huge success of Netherlands, all of O'Neill's work is received with a lot of attention. Goodwin, for example, has been reviewed in all of the major English language newspapers. And although the reviews have mostly been positive, they have almost all concluded that the novel is partially flawed. However, agreeing on what this actually means or in what way it is partially flawed is a much more complex issue. And in truth, I have to say, I don't think I've ever encountered a novel that has provoked such diverging opinions. For example, the late key section in which a French football agent, Jean-Luc Lefebvre, excuse my pronunciation, recounts his adventures in Africa, and this is alternatively described by reviewers as both the best and the worst sections of the novel. The narrative voice of the Afro-American character Lakeisha is, for one critic, I quote, brilliantly conceived, witty and incisive, and utterly contemporary, while for another critic she is a dreadfully boring character. And the end has been described as both, and I quote, one of the most absurd endings I've read in some time, and one of the most satisfying endings I have read in some time. So much for the newspaper critics. This divergence does, however, I would propose, suggest an exceptional capacity on O'Neill's part to create works which resist facile classification. Most of the critics mostly laud most of it, but not the whole. To a degree, this may be attributed to the influence of the nature of the literary review, in which a formulaic model, which always demands, if you like, particularly in the penultimate paragraph, a negative caveat. And this imposes itself perhaps to some extent, but it's also, I think, due to the fact that O'Neill is capable of creating a narrative of a very broad reach, which borrows from, for example, the classic adventure story and also other genres who, in effect, act as a homage to a plurality of traditions that demands we engage with, if you like, the broadest global framework while registering the differential but ambivalent qualities of the entities within that whole. Indeed, most of the criticism, as evident in the examples given, is that certain bits don't fit the overall narrative. And O'Neill's achievement, in my view, is to challenge the reader to put the seemingly dissonant elements into contact, to connect or associate, that soccer word again, without subsuming the discrete elements to the power of the whole. In other words, to place in dialogue patently different discourses and to offer a template for engagement which provides for the possibility, the possibility of, to echo what Walter Mignolo on Tuesday called pluriversality. As a result, critics, interviewers, and even O'Neill himself have been reluctant to attempt a summary of what initially has the form of a traditional adventure narrative, which should lend itself to an easy retelling, but not so. In any case, I'm a little bit reluctant, but I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to give you a summary of the novel. It's impossible to understand it or what conclusions we can draw to it without a relatively extensive summary of the novel. And I would suggest, spoiler alert at this stage, it's an absolutely wonderful novel. This is it here, so if anybody is interested, feel free to cover your ears. The novel is initially set in a technical writers' co-op in pre-Trump 2015 Pittsburgh. And the novel has two narrators. The first, a middle-aged Afro-American woman, Lakeisha Williams, is the co-lead or co-head of the organization and is struggling to negotiate an increasingly fractious work atmosphere, exemplified by the physical altercation protagonized by the second narrator, Mark Wolf. Wolf, of European descent, is a 30-something failed scientist now writing grants for Big Pharma. In the wake of the altercation, Wolf is contacted from London by his estranged half-French, half-brother Jeff, urgently explaining that, in a bid to set up as a football agent in London, he has paid $5,000 to an Ivorian middleman for 3 months' exclusive access to video footage of a young African player known as Godwin. I'm not saying he's as good as Messi. I'd never say that, but he's like him, says Jeff. But the problem is they have little time to spare and no idea where Godwin is from. The only clue, the rundown stadium from where the footage of Godwin is taken. Jeff pleads with Mark to help him find the boy. You're the cleverest person I know. If you can't find him, no one can. That said, they're estranged brothers, but in any case. Encouraged by his Tamil wife, clearly concerned at her husband's mental state and convinced he would benefit from reconciliation with his family, Wolf immediately takes leave from work and flies to London, only to find himself sleeping on a treadmill at the home of the family of a young footballer for whom his brother is acting as agent. Thrown into the murky world of mainly failed ex-footballers, such as Jeff, who will stop at nothing to find the child superstar who will make them rich quick, Wolf is sent to Paris and then Le Mans to meet Jean-Luc Lefebvre, a hardened, cynical French football agent in his 70s, anxious to make one last killing from the game. Lefebvre knows his football, having in part discovered the Ivory Coast and Chelsea superstar Didier Drogba. And Jeff estimates that he will be able to both verify the exceptional quality of Godwin and help to find him. Met by a tracksuited, cheroot-smoking, pastis-drinking Lefebvre at his home, Wolf immediately attempts to show him the video of Godwin, only to find that the Frenchman stalls him with photos and anecdotes of his past successes, and his extensive philosophizing on the nature and, note the phrase, growing supremacy of the African footballer, and particularly the immigrant black footballer who represented supposedly the new ideal, genetic attributes of explosivity and strength combined with the mental discipline and cultural habits of the European, without the loss of primitive unpredictability of the street footballer, supposedly something long lost to the overcoached white boys. It was the best market. The African market was, without question, the best market. He says it was a gold mine. Lefebvre was not, however, willing to provide knowledge or information without payment in advance. Unsurprising. Finding that his clearly penniless brother was unwilling to front up the cash either for Lefebvre or Wolf's expenses, and feeling betrayed, he decided to go it alone. And by the means of knowledge of geolocation technology he had become familiar with through his work with Big Pharma, he managed to locate the stadium. It was in, just a second here. Okay, it was in Benin, West Africa, specifically in the remote inland city of Natitingau. I hope that pronunciation is correct. This East Coast American liberal then begins rationalizing to himself on the potential business ahead. Why would I turn my back on such an opportunity? It's true that becoming a millionaire is something I have never seriously contemplated, and in fact have always held in contempt. Money and greed for money are the sources of almost all evil. For years I challenged capitalism. For years I turned my back on personal gain. I've paid my dues, you could say. And I have a family to support. My financial obligations are as real as the next guy's. I have as much a right as anyone to a measure of material prosperity. A greater right, arguably, because I would be a conscientious and charitable custodian of my wealth who could be counted on to pay my fair share of taxes. Also, this kid Godwin needs the help of an honest person like me. There are sharks out there. It's my time. So, he takes the decision to drop his brother, goes back to Lefebvre in the knowledge that he would need his expertise in Africa, and strikes a deal with him to become partners. However, with partnership papers signed by both, plane tickets bought, and substantial cash withdrawn, he wakens on the day of the flight to find Lefebvre has absconded to Africa with the lot. Shocked into a realization that he is out of his depth, he flies back home to Pittsburgh, speaks to his boss Lashika to ask for more work and more responsibility, and tries to settle back into his routine in the midst of a struggle for power at the co-op. Months later, having just put his daughter to bed, the doorbell rings and he finds his visitor is Jean-Luc Lefebvre. The scene is thus set for the embedded narrative of Lefebvre's visit to Benin in search of Godwin, staged in a manner clearly meant to evoke the narrative of Marlowe and Conrad's Heart of Darkness. For the following 75 pages, Lefebvre recounts the Frenchman's adventure in a masterful exhibition of storytelling from O'Neill in the voice of Wolfe. Lefebvre expounds his ideas on everything from, he takes the opportunity to really let go. He expounds the 75 pages of his own homespun philosophy on everything from women's football to the peculiar psychology of goalkeepers, famous football air crashes, tourism in Africa, the capricious nature of humanitarian aid doctors, the corruption of African football, the history of colonization, the history of the kingdom of Dahomey, voodooism and traditional African religions, the role of the griot, the immemorial history of violence in Africa, the psychology of poverty in Africa, and that of his own single mother who had, for her whole life, earned a meagre living as a cleaner, stuck at the bottom of the social ladder because, he suspected, his father had been an occupying German soldier in World War II. All in all, a masterclass of mansplaining in the face of his own multiple traumas. Questioned by Wolfe's wife as to whether or not he had children, his response was as follows. Madame Lefebvre replies magnificently, like the president of France. I'm not going to try the French accent. Not every man is the destiny of the father. Some men, he pontificates, are made for the home, for the family, for the life of safety. Others, a condemned minority, are made for life beyond the home, a life of motion and solitude, the life of the sailor, one could say. You'll find you might fall in love with him by the end of the story, but anyway. Wolfe's reaction is to think of him as a man who is ignorant of his own ignorances, who confuses solipsism with philosophical thought, who privileges his random musings merely because they happen to have occurred to him. Not to be a snob, but who does he think he is? What qualifies him to play on the same field, so to speak, as professional thinkers? His self-absorption, his disappearance up his own ass is total. He had, of course, absconded with all the money to Africa, so it's understandable. But what Wolfe really wants to know is, where is Godwin? And eventually, Lefebvre reveals all. He had contracted an experienced tourist guide on the coast and had driven inland, eventually reaching Natitingau, and after many false leads, eventually located the parents of Godwin, with whom he had tried to cut a deal, only to find that Godwin was estranged from the family. Following another lead, he returns to the coast, to the city of Ouida, which you can see on the screen at the bottom left corner here. Sorry, this doesn't seem to... it's on the coast to the left. He returns to the coast, and I say to the city of Ouida, determined not to give up on what he terms, Lefebvre terms, an impossible spiritual mission, and that maybe, in the figure of Godwin, he would resurrect the honourable sport of his youth. An idealistic man. Informed that Godwin might be found training on the beach, his guide, Fulbert, reluctantly took him there, stopping on the way at the site of the historic fort of St. John the Baptist of Ouida, built by the Portuguese. Impatient at the fact Fulbert had brought him there and spoken of its history, Lefebvre stated he was not opposed to history, to remembrance, the museums, the statue, but he was in the football business, not in the business of commemoration. He was trying to prepare for a decisive encounter with Godwin. What Fulbert had told him was that the fort had been built for the slave trade, that only Luanda in Angola had exported more slaves than Ouida. More than 1 million had left from there for the sugar and tobacco plantations of Brazil, which hadn't abolished slavery until 1888. The guide pointed out a tree where slaves had been auctioned and a building where they were branded for sale. But after a pause, Fulbert had also remarked, well, a well-run cafeteria serving the expensive coffee and cakes the tourists like would be successful at this location. A good example, I think, of the clash of discourses. Subsequently, they took the dirt road to the beach, and on the guide's insistence, they stopped the car and walked the last stretch along the so-called route of the slaves. In the footsteps of the captives who for centuries had taken this very path to the beach. We have to imagine, Lefebvre tells his Pittsburgh audience, the point of view of the captured ones. They came from the interior. They had never perceived the ocean. Their terror was great. Arriving at the beach, Lefebvre and Fulbert then encounter what is described as an imposing and sinister monument, the door of no return. Now we have a couple of... It's quite moving to see this. You can hear in this slide here, you can see very clearly the representation of the slaves. This, Lefebvre suggested, was unnecessary. It and the dirt road not actually being, he'd found out that they were not actually natural historical remnants, but rather artificial constructs of UNESCO. And I quote from Lefebvre, the reality of non-return was very easily observable in the infinite empty body of water that was the true end point of the slave route. Never before had the ocean terrified him. It was overwhelming, he said. It was like Auschwitz. Not long after, they ran into Godwin, who at this stage we see as, I suppose, a sort of a modern-day slave. Walking on the beach, Lefebvre spotted a far-off group of runners. Closer and closer they came, and then, in an instant, they had passed. 20 or so young men running barefoot and chanting as they ran, with a clearly recognizable Godwin, taller and more impressive than ever, at the head of the pack. When they had passed, Fulbert told Lefebvre that he had discovered that Godwin was associating with an American couple who were staying at a particular hotel. Lefebvre commanded, note the vocabulary, his guide to bring him to the hotel, where he paid him his finder's bonus and checked in. Now, I must advise you that what comes next may stretch your credibility. The couple were, in fact, Wolfe's half-brother and his estranged, glamorous blonde mother. To cut a long story short, they had beaten Lefebvre to Godwin and signed him up. And in the face of bureaucratic difficulties, and what she, the mother, called her lifelong dream to have an African baby, the mother had proceeded to adopt Godwin, in effect turning him into Wolfe's brother and giving him American citizenship. She had also asked Lefebvre to act as Godwin's football agent on the condition that, in a gesture towards family reconciliation, they all collectively form a company. And Lefebvre had in fact travelled to Pittsburgh precisely to convince Wolfe to sign up to the project. In the final chapter of the novel, narrated by Lakeisha, we find out that Wolfe had in fact signed up, and he had resigned from his job at the co-op. And she, meanwhile, in preparation for a showdown with a colleague trying to take over the leadership, had taken the decision to arm herself with Fulani braids. Hair, she decided, has power. However, before the meeting starts, the news breaks that Wolfe, his mother, and his brother have all died in a plane crash in Gambia. I said it, as I say, it stretches credibility. But the upshot of this is that Wolfe's wife is now responsible for Godwin, as his official next of kin, while he was now also the chief competitor of her daughter for Wolfe's mother's substantial fortune. Hugely shaken by Wolfe's death and shocked into a realization of the soulless nature of the endless struggles of her corporate life, Lakeisha resigns and returns to live in her hometown, Milwaukee, to re-engage with her own family, still living in a predominantly working-class Afro-American neighbourhood. And there is one final twist. In the wake of Wolfe's death, a friendship had developed between his wife and Lakeisha. And on a visit to Lakeisha, she made a proposal. Although Godwin was homeless and disowned by his family, Lefebvre had secured for him a full scholarship at a top soccer academy in the United States, in Wisconsin, just 40 minutes from Milwaukee. Would she consider becoming Godwin's guardian? Godwin's guardian? He needed a family. The final section opens with Lakeisha returning to her apartment from a walk in the snow to be told her guests had arrived. She turned, and there he is, Godwin, wrapped in a voluminous puffy jacket, shiny silver that comes down below his knees, and a red baseball hat, with an older man in an old-fashioned wool overcoat, Lefebvre. That night, lying in bed, Godwin is staying in the room next door. Lying in bed with the bedroom door locked, she felt grateful to Godwin. He helped her start fixing a problem, she reflected. Becoming Godwin's caretaker or American mum would benefit me too, she says. Pure benevolence is not sustainable. Mutually beneficial arrangements are the most durable and do the most good. The novel ends with Lakeisha leaving Lefebvre to his train, then walking to her new job, filled with excitement. And she ends, and these are the final lines of the novel, things can change for the better as well as for the worse. Who would have foreseen a mere few months ago that I would find myself back in my home city with a fine young man in my care, working for the Hillary for America campaign. President Hillary Clinton, Mr. Godwin Annable. There is so much to look forward to. Now that ending, that final framing in the context of the struggle of values being played out in US politics as we speak, would be so funny if, of course, it were actually funny. The novel was, of course, only published earlier this year before Kamala Harris became a candidate for president. So I suppose perhaps we have a second chance at it. But in any case, in interviews, O'Neill is brutally frank about his fears for the immediate future. His fear of, as he puts it, having Caligula in the White House. And his fears seem to increasingly shape his fiction, such as Godwin. While some readers or listeners may balk at the bizarre turns of plot, the inverisimilitude of the coincidences, the black and sometimes plain daft humour used in relation to themes of such deep gravity, there is a method to what he does and a deep underlying seriousness and bravery. Humour as a tool to speak truth to power has a long history, and a long history of hitting the mark. Despots, Caligula included, are not much known for their sense of humour. The same, I suppose, can be said of our orange friend. In a recent interview, O'Neill stated his baseline. What I am trying to do is write something sufficiently entertaining that people will actually read it. And that people will think, hold on, maybe I should apply some interpretative pressure to it. His view is that Netherland was a work of fiction that managed to push itself to the centre of the New York cultural conversation. But he says it was 2008. People were still reading books. And I don't think reading culture had been decimated to the extent it is now. It's quite apocalyptic. So if he gets a reader, he will hold on to them. And the chance to go deeper will then emerge, in the heritage of literature and in the history of ideas in general. The narrative energy of Godwin is stunning. And here he takes his cue from the adventure story. Treasure Island, he cites, for example. And this allows him to expose the absurdity of the obsessive hunt for bounty while unfolding, at the same time, a ferocious critique of the extractive culture that has driven capitalism since the days of slavery and the rapacious plunder of natural resources of colonization which devastated human and natural environments and continue to do so. The parallel with the brutally extractive culture of today's football industry is explicit, as throughout the novel, the African kids for exploitation are referred to as, for example, gold, diamonds, and black pearls. O'Neill also takes his cue from the Irish absurdist comic tradition of Beckett and Flann O'Brien, the title perhaps in part borrowed from the former is waiting for Godot. Also, he seems to draw from the tradition of the continent-hopping comic novel, which allows him to trace a darkly comic route that resonates with the tragedy of the triangular slave trade, which, like Godwin, linked Europe, especially England and France, with West Africa and America. The interpretative pressure to which O'Neill alludes leaves the reader with no choice to ask questions about our eventual involvement in the exploitative value system of global reach, whose effects are most visible in a more vulnerable Africa, but which connects with and implicates the likes of the corporate culture in Pittsburgh and Big Pharma. The triangular trade of Godwin ultimately asks us to join the dots and demand a recognition that the currently hegemonic model is underwritten by all the players, all the fans, and in Tony Jute's words from Ilfar's The Land, the ideological cheerleaders, but also that the roots go back centuries to the emergence of a consumer capitalism whose early punters, whose early fans were fans of sugar, tobacco, etc. Can we realistically challenge or change the existing value system? In an interview, O'Neill highlights a counterpoint to the extractive, adventurer, winner tradition that has driven Western capitalism for centuries. As well as a treasure hunt, the novel is about, he says, the opposite, which is the conception of life not as this jackpot-type narrative, but one of cooperation, mutual care. So it is about where our values are. Yet these values must be robust, he says. Lakeisha, he says, is on the one hand an icon of cooperation, but she is also blindsided by her own ideals. It just takes one actor of bad faith to bring things down. We see this in the fragility, for example, of the fairy tale ending, bitingly and I would say brilliantly undercut by the closing Trumpian reference. And yet the ultimate proposal is, I would suggest, robust. Far from advocating a soft, patronising humanitarianism or charity, if we imply the interpretative pressure to which O'Neill refers and take the cuttingly ironic finish of Much to Look Forward to as a cue to closely read again the closing pages and to challenge the easy teleology of progress and go back, we find perhaps an illustrative template for practical action. At the end of the novel, when Lakeisha first meets Godwin, she turns and says, "There he is, Godwin." This statement of presence does seem significant, and perhaps it rings a bell. My own interpretation of it is it does suggest an homage to Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway, which ends referring to the central protagonist Clarissa, for there she was. And to conclude, I think this is what Godwin is ultimately about. If Mrs. Dalloway ends centred on a society lady, strong in a subjective presence after hosting a successful party attended by the top of the social hierarchy, including the Prime Minister, O'Neill turns this on its head and proposes the vulnerable black African refugee child in cold, snowy Milwaukee, now for the first time with a room of his own, as the ethical fulcrum of his story. The intentionality is explicit. Godwin is, as the text states towards the end, the central character. However, this number one character is not presented in triumphalism, but rather as a model of, to echo Lakeisha, how to start fixing a problem. In essence, that is a template of a ground-up fostering of social engagement or association, that football word, that prioritises mutual interdependence and care, from which will accrue the mutual benefit of an intersubjective identity. Does Godwin become a winner? Does he make it as the new Messi? We don't know. But all suggests that with the values that underpin his creation, he might just make it onto the first team of Afroeuropeas. But that decision would ultimately depend on El Mister, or more appropriately, La Mister, Marta Sofia. Thank you very much for your attention.